You're crouched at the mouth of a low opening in the earth, watching the last smear of daylight get erased by wind. Above you, winter isn't a season, it's an active predator. The air bites skin, the ground crunches, every breath feels expensive. You duck inside. The world becomes smaller: stone, packed soil, bodies pressed close, and a dim orange pulse from a fire that's doing 3 jobs at once: heat, light, and the promise that tomorrow might still exist. The warmth is real, but so is the smoke. It hangs under the ceiling like a second darkness, curling into noses and lungs, turning comfort into risk. Today, winter is something you scroll past. If you're cold, you turn a dial, pull on a jacket, complain online, and move on. For them, winter demanded math. How much fuel, how many calories, how many hours of light, how many people can fit before the air turns dangerous or tempers snap. One wrong choice, too little food, a fire that smolders, a night spent exposed, and the story ends quietly. And this wasn't a rare crisis, it was routine. So if winter above ground was a threat, what exactly did underground actually mean for ancient humans? Here's the part nobody tells you about surviving winter underground. It wasn't hiding. Hiding is what you do when you've run out of options. What ancient humans built, whether in caves, rock shelters, or semi-subterranean homes, was a system, and systems have rules. The popular image is simple: go underground, get warm, wait it out. But cold is only the loudest enemy. In many situations, smoke could be worse than the weather, because the same fire that keeps you alive can also poison the air. Calories could be worse than cold, because you can't tough out a shortage of fat and protein when the landscape stops providing. And in crowded, enclosed spaces, illness and infection risks likely rose, not because people were careless, but because winter forces bodies close together for weeks. So the real question isn't, did they find a hole and survive? It's, how did they manage heat, air, food, and social friction all at once, without modern tools, modern medicine, or modern certainty? Some parts of that story are confirmed by archaeology: hearths, soot, seasonal layers, food remains. Other parts are likely routines, fuel choices, ventilation habits. A few are still hypotheses, because organic materials and daily behaviors don't fossilize. By the end, you'll have the full winter survival stack, and you'll never look at a dark shelter the same way again. That's the real puzzle. But before we talk tactics, we need one grounding truth: underground doesn't automatically mean warm. Underground can mean several different things, and the distinction matters. Sometimes it's a deep cave system, stable, dark, and protected from wind. More often it's a shallow rock shelter, an overhang that blocks weather but still breathes with the outside air. In other regions and time periods, underground means human-made architecture: pit houses and semi-subterranean huts dug partially into the soil, sometimes topped with wood, hide, and thatch. Later agricultural societies built earth lodges and similar structures that sit low to the ground, using the earth itself as insulation. These are all below the surface in different ways, and they don't solve the same problems. Archaeology is great at preserving the durable and terrible at preserving the ordinary. Stone tools last. Burnt bone lasts. Charcoal and ash can last. But ropes, furs, wooden frames, woven mats, and the daily habits that made a shelter livable usually vanish. That means we often see the skeleton of a winter strategy, not the soft tissue. So when we say something is confirmed, it's usually because there's direct physical evidence: hearths, soot staining, repeated ash layers, concentrated food remains, or structures cut into the ground. When we say likely, we're connecting those traces to behaviors that make practical sense. How do researchers tell whether a site was used in winter? One line of evidence is seasonality in animal remains. The age of hunted animals, patterns in teeth, or seasonal markers like antler growth can suggest what time of year a kill happened. Another is the rhythm of occupation: layers, repeated fires, trampled floors, and dense debris can imply people stayed long enough to live, not just pass through. Tool maintenance, debris, cooking waste, and storage pits can all push the story from visited to inhabited. None of this gives us a calendar date, but it lets us see patterns enough to ask the next question with confidence, instead of fantasy. And that's where the story begins. Now that we know what counts as evidence, we can ask the first real question: why go underground at all? If you've ever stepped into a basement on a sweltering day and felt the air turn instantly cooler, you already understand the first advantage of going underground: the earth is a shock absorber. Temperatures swing wildly above ground, but soil and stone change slowly. In winter, that can mean the space beneath the surface stays closer to the annual average than the air outside, which is a fancy way of saying it can be less lethal. This is confirmed in the simplest sense by physics, and supported indirectly by the kinds of places people repeatedly chose to occupy: sheltered cavities, overhangs, and dug-in floors that reduce exposure. Wind is the real thief. It strips heat from skin and carries it away. Block the wind and you've already won half the battle, even if the thermometer hasn't changed much. That's the mini reveal most people miss. Underground was often about creating a calm microclimate, not a tropical refuge. But here's the catch: caves aren't automatically cozy. Many are damp, and dampness turns cold into something that feels personal. Water conducts heat away from your body far faster than dry air, and wet bedding is basically an apology letter to hypothermia. Some caves also act like chimneys or traps, depending on their shape. A narrow entrance can protect you from gusts, but it can also limit fresh airflow. So while underground spaces can stabilize temperature, they can also concentrate the problems that kill you quietly. The archaeology backs this "it depends" story. What we often find are hearths and ash lenses in places that balance protection with ventilation, entrances, overhangs, or areas with enough air exchange to keep a fire usable. That's confirmed where repeated soot staining and fire residues appear in the same zones over time. The precise reasons for each choice are usually likely rather than certain, because the decision-making lived in mines, not in stones. Even the warmth advantage can be misleading. In some climates, the underground temperature might hover just above freezing, which is still cold enough to kill you, just slower. And if a shelter sits near water, winter floods or dripping ceilings can turn a safe space into a refrigerator. Choosing a site meant reading the landscape, slope, drainage, exposure, and how the air moved through the opening. Get it wrong, and the season punishes you hard. And then there's the human-made option, the semi-subterranean hut. Digging down reduces surface area exposed to wind, and the surrounding soil buffers temperature swings. But it also creates a new question: if your roof and walls do their job too well, where does the smoke go? Okay, underground can help. But it only matters if you can solve the next problem: heat without turning your shelter into a smoke chamber. Fire is the oldest piece of technology that still feels like magic. You can be surrounded by ice and darkness, and a few glowing coals turn a hostile world into a room. Archaeologically, the presence of that room is often one of the clearest confirmed signals we have: hearths, ash lenses, charcoal, heat-altered stone, and soot stains that show fires were lit in the same places again and again. People weren't just passing through, they were maintaining heat, cooking, and organizing life around a controlled flame. But here's the problem: a fire doesn't only produce warmth. It produces smoke, and in an enclosed or poorly ventilated space, smoke becomes its own winter hazard. You don't need a blizzard to be in trouble, you just need a shelter that holds onto air a little too well. Even a small hearth can fill a low ceiling with irritants and reduce visibility until the whole space feels like breathing through cloth. The modern version of this is a cozy cabin fire, but ancient humans didn't have chimneys, fans, or a carbon monoxide alarm politely screaming at them. They had their senses, their experience, and the consequences. And because a glow can advertise your location, controlling a hearth was also about discretion, not just comfort, especially at night. So what did they do? Some parts are confirmed indirectly. Hearths clustered near entrances or under higher ceilings suggest people were thinking about airflow. Soot patterns can hint at where smoke tended to accumulate. The rest is likely, inferred from practicality and ethnographic parallels: choosing fuels that burn more cleanly, tending fires to reduce smoldering, and using openings, natural or made, to keep air moving. None of this required formal science. It required something older: noticing that one placement makes your eyes burn and another lets you sleep. This is where the romantic image of safe underground warmth collapses into a more impressive reality. Winter survival meant managing a controlled hazard inside your home every single day. The fire was your heater, your stove, your lamp, and sometimes your enemy. It was also social gravity: people gather where the light is. That clustering matters, because it concentrates heat and comfort, but also noise, tension, and the shared risk of bad air. The original air quality crisis wasn't industrial. It was domestic. And once you can keep the fire burning without choking on it, you meet the next brutal constraint: calories. Even if you can breathe, warmth doesn't feed you, so the next question is brutal: how do you not starve? Winter doesn't kill you with drama, it kills you with arithmetic. When the landscape stops giving, your body keeps subtracting. Modern people forget this because we outsource calories to a lit aisle and a plastic bag. If you're hungry in January, you're not facing winter, you're facing an inconvenience with snacks. For ancient humans, winter was an energy audit. Cold demands fuel, and that fuel is you. You burn more calories just staying warm, while food becomes harder to find, harder to process, and harder to preserve. That's why having a shelter was never enough. You needed a plan that survived weeks of scarcity, because even a tough, healthy person runs out of stored body fat faster than their confidence runs out. Some of this planning is confirmed by what gets left behind. Archaeologists find pits and caches, concentrated animal bones, and residues that suggest repeated processing and storage. Dried meat and fish don't fossilize neatly, but the patterns of butchery, cut marks, and transport decisions can show when people were preparing for later consumption rather than immediate feasting. Rendered fat is harder to see directly, yet it matters because fat is winter's real currency. Lean meat fills your stomach, fat keeps your organs working when temperatures drop. In some contexts, people appear to have cracked bones to extract marrow and, likely, to boil fragments for grease, an unglamorous process with a glamorous payoff: calories that store. Then there's the hunting calendar. Many groups likely timed winter survival around seasonal abundance, migrations, spawning runs, or predictable animal behavior. You don't outhunt winter, you intercept it. This is where the story becomes local. In some places the best strategy may have been large game and careful storage. In others, it could have been a mix of smaller animals, plant foods, and relentless gathering whenever weather allowed. The evidence changes by region and time period, and any universal claim should. Darkness is the part of winter most modern people never truly meet. You can be cold, wet, miserable, and still have light at the tap of a switch. Underground, in a world lit only by flame, night isn't a backdrop, it's a pressure. It changes how long an hour feels, how far a shelter seems from safety, and how quickly your mind starts inventing problems. This is where the evidence gets quietly fascinating. Confirmed, in some archaeological contexts we find traces of artificial lighting beyond simple hearths, stone lamps, burned residues, soot-stained ceilings, and repeated blackening deeper in shelters where daylight can't reach. That kind of staining doesn't prove exactly what people said or did, but it does suggest repeated, organized use of firelight in enclosed spaces. Somebody was managing darkness, not merely enduring it. But light comes with trade-offs. The same flame that gives you vision consumes oxygen and makes smoke. So every choice about illumination is also a choice about air, fuel, and risk. In modern life, lighting is free enough that we leave rooms glowing for no reason. In winter underground life, a lamp is a budget item. Every extra hour of light costs calories in the form of gathered wood or rendered fat, and time spent outside finding it. Likely, winter became a social season. When travel is dangerous and hunting windows are narrow, people concentrate their lives inside. That creates time for the things you can't do while moving: tool repair, making cordage, shaping points, sharpening edges, mending hides, planning routes, teaching children, telling stories that carry knowledge. It's easy to romanticize this as cozy. It was also psychological infrastructure. A group that can keep attention, morale, and routine intact is less likely to make stupid mistakes. Here's the mini reveal: boredom is a survival threat. Not because ancient humans were weak-minded, but because boredom makes your brain seek stimulation, and stimulation in a constrained environment often looks like conflict, risk-taking, or careless decisions with fire and food. In the dark, small errors multiply. So the question isn't just how they stayed warm. It's how they stayed mentally stable in a world where the sun disappeared and the walls closed in. And that mental load leads directly to the next problem. Pack enough people together long enough, and even a good shelter can start to feel like a trap. That's when winter becomes social and volatile. Put enough people in a tight space for long enough, and winter stops being a weather problem and becomes a social experiment. The shelter can be perfect, the fire steady, the food rationed, and still, the group can fracture. Modern life gives us escape hatches, separate rooms, headphones, a walk around the block. Underground, there is no block. There is just the same faces, the same smoke, the same narrow routines, day after day. That's why survival isn't only about calories and insulation, it's about behavior. We can't confirm ancient rules the way we can confirm a hearth. But anthropology gives us a useful lens. Many hunter-gatherer groups documented in recent history show seasonal patterns where people aggregate in harsher months and spread out when resources return. When groups compress, friction rises. Small annoyances become grudges. Sleep gets interrupted. Noise becomes constant. And the stakes make it worse, because a careless spark or a stolen portion isn't just rude, it's dangerous. Crowding also changes health risk. In enclosed spaces, coughing spreads more easily than myths do. Poor ventilation can irritate lungs and eyes, and constant smoke exposure may have made people more vulnerable to respiratory problems, even if we can't measure it precisely for every site. So winter shelters likely demanded routines that protected more than comfort: where the fire sat, who tended it, when people rotated spots, how food was divided, and how conflicts were settled before they exploded. This is where culture functions like technology. Likely, groups developed roles: someone keeps the fire, someone processes food, someone watches children, someone handles repairs, because predictable responsibility reduces chaos. Shared rituals may have mattered too, not as mystical extras, but as tools for synchronization: stories that teach, songs that coordinate, rules that feel sacred enough to follow when everyone's tired and hungry. Archaeology sometimes hints at these pressures. Healed injuries, worn teeth, and dense occupation layers can suggest long stays. They don't reveal arguments, but they do reveal that people endured proximity for seasons together. And if you're thinking, fine, so they managed winter with social structure, you're already close to the strangest twist. Because once you realize how brutal those months could be, a question almost asks itself: did anyone ever try to skip the whole thing by sleeping through winter the way some animals do? That brings us to the weirdest question people always ask, and the answer is stranger than the meme version. At some point in every winter conversation, someone asks the same question: could humans just hibernate? Crawl underground, slow the body down, and wake up when the world stops trying to kill you. It's a tempting idea, mostly because it sounds easier than hauling firewood in a blizzard. Here's what would need to be true. You'd expect evidence of people entering long, immobile states, specialized sleeping spaces, repeated seasonal patterns of minimal activity, and bodies showing adaptations for extreme metabolic slowdown. In animals that truly hibernate, physiology shifts in ways humans simply don't have. Our core temperature control, fat storage patterns, and sleep architecture aren't built for months of near shutdown. There have been intriguing modern medical cases where humans survive extreme cold or long periods of reduced consciousness, and there's ongoing research into therapeutic hypothermia. But that's not the same thing as an evolved winter strategy. For most of human history, choosing to sleep it out would mean gambling your life on not getting colder, not getting dehydrated, not being attacked, and not waking up weaker than when you went in. That's not a plan. That's a coin flip with frostbite. So when you hear claims about ancient human hibernation, treat them as hypothesis at best, and often as a myth dressed up in scientific vocabulary. The likely truth is less flashy and more human. We survived winter the way we survive everything, by stacking small advantages. Better shelters. Smarter fires. Stored calories. Shared labor. Stories that kept children quiet and adults sane. If anything, winter didn't make us sleepy. It made us organized. It forced planning, cooperation, and a kind of mental endurance that no cave could provide on its own. Once you remove the myth, what's left is more impressive. Winter didn't just test bodies, it changed what humans became. By the time you zoom out, the question stops being how did they survive winter underground, and becomes how did they build a world that could survive winter at all? Because underground wasn't a single trick. It was a stack. A stack built from mistakes and solutions that lasted. First came the physics, stone and soil that soften temperature swings and block the wind that steals heat fastest. Then came the controlled hazard at the center of everything, fire, placed intended so it warmed more than it choked. Then the math of food, stored calories, hunts, fat saved for the weeks when the landscape went quiet. Then light, rationed and managed, pushing back the dark enough for hands to keep working and minds to stay steady. And finally the part we rarely call technology, even though it might be the most important, social cohesion. Rules, roles, shared rhythms, and stories that turned a shelter into something like a home. We tend to define technology as objects you can hold, blades, needles, tools, machines. But for most of human history, technologies were invisible. They lived in decisions, routines, and knowledge passed from mouth to ear, night after night, under a ceiling stained by smoke. So picture that opening again, winter outside like a predator, warmth inside like a fragile agreement. Every breath is proof the system worked. And if you want more stories like this, there's a simple way to help. Subscribe for evidence-first stories about ancient humans. I make deep dives that explain how real people solved real problems without turning history into homework.